I did check the settings after.
Yeah, well, you should use the PA.
Are we good?
I thought we'll get it started here in a few minutes, but I want to. Can you hear me all right?
Well, I got a mic there. It's working.
Check. How's this? Better. Courtesy of Diane and Aaron. Thank you very much. I think some of you have gone through the stack room today, and the person responsible for that is Joanne Farr. And I want to say a few things about Joanne before she has a few things to say. But Joanne is from Lecompton, rural Lecompton, and she's a nationally and probably internationally known health educator and author. She's a scientist, microbiologist, and in my opinion, a great cook. We just had a meal at her place a couple of days ago, and it was fantastic, and I'm sure you all agree that she's a great cook, sampling some of her edibles back there. So, Joanne, would you like to say a few things?
First of all, I did not actually cook the food back there. That's pretty much all straight out of the store, except for the cookies, which my daughter cooked. So I just wanted to let you know there's a lot of new research now that is suggesting that adopting a plant-based diet is probably the single most important thing an individual can do right now to help stop climate change and to improve their own health. And there are just so many delicious options of plant-based meat alternatives, cheese alternatives, baked goods, and that's why I brought these things to show you that to follow a plant-based diet is really not, a deprivation at all. And everything back there, I know most of you have been through the line, so most of it's all gluten-free also, and completely plant-based on the one table. And there's also a lot of free information back there if you want to know about how plant-based diets can help prevent and reverse all of our top chronic diseases. We've got information on that along with recipes. And just keep in mind, there is only one diet that has ever been shown to open clogged arteries, and it's a whole food plant-based diet. And in closing, I'll just say this lifestyle has been such a blessing to myself and to my whole family that we really are just excited to be able to share information with other people, and we are grateful that we found out about it. And that's why we are so excited to hear about this talk today, because we just want to learn more about the early pioneers that really laid the foundation for us to do what we're doing now today. And I also want to express gratitude to Tim for arranging these presentations. I've been coming now for several weeks, and I've just loved the lectures, and I just really appreciate what you're doing here. So thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. Well, I guess I should. Most of you know me. I'm Tim. Take care of Constitution Hall here. I want to thank you all for coming out. You're good Marty Kansans to come out in this kind of weather, and you didn't fail. This is the fourth program in the six-part Bleeding Kansas program series. And I would be remiss. I know I did have some cookies back there for you, and I always recognize Charlene Winter back there. She'll be back next week with her homemade cookies. But I really want to thank Joanne and Joe for coming out, and their snacks are segue nicely, germane to the subject at hand today. And this is a unique building that we're in, Constitution Hall. And I know you've heard me say this many times over, but this building's been here 163 years now. Made out of native cottonwood, black walnut. It's one of the oldest, if not the oldest, wood building in the state of Kansas. Somehow it survived. It predates Kansas statehood. by 5 years, predates the Civil War by 5 years. So I think it's appropriate we do these talks here and inside a building where, 162, 163 years ago, some of the issues that we talk about in this program series were discussed today in this very room where history happened. And I think I'm going to introduce our guest speaker now. Are we ready to go? Okay. Today's program is Do Not Hurt, the early animal rights movement in the 1856 Free State Vegetarian Settlement. And our speakers today are Diane Eichhoff and Aaron Barnard. And they are authors and historians. And this program today will be Diane's 5th appearance and Aaron's 3rd appearance, so total of 8 completing Kansas program series. Aaron and Diane are Kansas City, Missouri residents. Diane is an independent historian, writer, reenactor, and editor of education materials. Her biography, which you have copies here today, Clorinda Nichols' Revolutionary Heart, the life of Clorinda Nichols and the Pioneering Crusade for Women's Rights, was named a Kansas Notable Book in 2007. And Aaron is a retired journalist, having spent 15 years as a television and media writer for the Kansas City Star newspaper. They are owners of Quindaro Press. They have co-authored and published in 2013 their book, The Big Divide, Travel Guide to the Historic and Civil War Sites in Missouri, Kansas, and Border Region. And they'll have copies of that available too. So with that, help me welcome Diane Eichhoff and Aaron Barnhart here to the 2019 Green Kansas program.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everyone. And yeah, great to be back in Lecompton. This is our, I think it's our 7th appearance because a couple of those were joint appearances. But who's counting, right? The point is, we keep coming back and you keep having us. And we were kind of looking over the room and realizing we have a lot of folks here that we've seen from time to time, and just delighted that we can present this. It's unusual for us because typically by the time we get on the speaking circuit, we've finished our research on something, we've written about it, or we published a book. That's the ideal thing. You want to give a talk and then sell copies of your book afterwards. But when Tim asked us kind of what we had in the hopper, and we told him, he said, "Oh, I got to get that scheduled." And I said, "Well, we won't have a book ready to go at that point, so it'll be a work in progress." And that, in fact, is exactly what it is. But that's kind of fun for us because I think kind of the mistake you make when you write that first book is that you really don't think about what you're going to say about your book to people until you're done with it. And then the first time you run into somebody says, "So what's your book about?" And you're like, well, give me a moment. By the time this book comes out, we'll have a very solid elevator pitch going for this thing. I can assure you of that. So we're going to get a little help moving the slides along, so if you'll advance to the next one. This is a story that has been told before. This is a story that was told just a few years after it happened, and then was told over the years, mostly by historical people writing for the public, popular, non-scholarly audiences. But in the process of this talk, I hope you'll see why it is that Diane and I have taken an interest in really revisiting the entire topic, top to bottom, and discovering the story that really was not told at any point about this mission. So, next slide, please.
Sorry.
This is the cover of a book that was published in 1862 that brought the world's attention to Kansas. Well, the world's attention was already focused on Kansas by 1862, but this was a story many of them had not heard. And the title of the book is Went to Kansas, being a thrilling account of an ill-fated expedition to that fairy land and its sad results, together with a sketch of the life of the author and how the world goes with her. The author is Miriam Davis Holt.
I discovered Miriam Davis Colt when I was doing the research for my first book on Claretta Nichols. And it's a tragic story, but it's the kind of thing that stays with you. And she was part of my brain from then on. I wondered what had happened at this vegetarian
Colony or
colony
settlement.
and settlement, and what was missing from this, because she was telling her tale, and I really could scarcely imagine what she had gone through.
The next slide. So we meaning you and I started to kind of explore what we knew factually about the story, and that meant visiting the site where this fairyland had hoped to situate.
Right. Not very much is left of this vegetarian colony to tell the story, but there is a site in
Allen County here.
Allen County.
And so we have Humboldt here, that way, Chanute that way, and you can see 169 highway cutting through. This is old 169 road there. As you can see, it crosses the Neosho River, and then in large type is the settlement.
So you can go there even today and find the rock and find the story that was told kind of early on.
Yeah, this is the story. If you've been, and we'll get into some of the particulars of it, but for probably the better part of 50 years, this has been the story that has been presented to the public. It's a rock, as Diane says, with a sign embedded in it, and it's right off of that exit to the Humboldt Chanute Road, and it's titled "The Sad Saga of Vegetarian Creek." You can see then someone used hardware store letters to point people to where they could actually drive 0.7 miles south, then turn left. And if you turn left and you look carefully, there's another sign that says now go, and you'll find it. And so eventually you will find the place in the road where a small body of water crosses it. Now that body of water is now known as Vegetarian Creek. So that was kind of the findings that we had here.
And the early thing from Miriam was she tells us the story of the death of two of her family members going on the way back to New York, and that story was so sad. It was the story of the death of her son and of her husband in Missouri after leaving the colony. And she describes this. It's in Boonville, and so we decided to take a trip over there and see what the deal was. And when we found the cemetery, it was an old cemetery that had been reserved for emancipated slaves and travelers. And since she was a traveler, that's where her loved ones were buried. And there is a sign on the gravestone that says, "Willie, the Little Stranger." And people of Boonville have kept this intact. And there's something about seeing a place where the people we were writing about actually lived and where things actually happened. That really kind of grabs you, makes the thing alive, makes it, you understand this is a real story that happened to real people way back then.
Yeah, and the story as Miriam Davis Colt presents it is, we went out to Kansas, our whole family, and we found that it was not as advertised, and we got sick, and we traveled back home with nothing more than really just the possessions and the shirts on our backs, and two of them did not make it home. So in Miriam Davis Colt's rendering, the story of the vegetarian colony is a tragedy, and perhaps a needless tragedy. So that's certainly one of the ways in which historical journals have, and popular history has remembered the vegetarian colony. But another way that it's been remembered, next slide, is as kind kind of a foolish endeavor in the first place. And this is telling, right? This take on the vegetarian colony as just kind of this act of lunacy for a bunch of people to go out west to Kansas and start a vegetarian colony. Why would somebody do that? This is a narrative that begins before the vegetarian colony. This is a piece from the Chicago Tribune, a newspaper that was anti-slavery and in many ways predisposed to be favorable to a group of anti-slavery settlers going out to Kansas. But they catch wind of this vegetarian settlement company now being organized in New York to continue in Kansas. And they just think that is a terrible idea. Kansas has got enough philosophers, fiddlers, phrenologists, vegetarians, etc. already. She needs beef-eating men. That's what Kansas needs. Sinewy men. Men will know how to settle in Kansas. And they term it a ridiculous fantasy. And again, this is before the first settler arrives at this settlement in Allen County. So that's another take on it. Next slide. And what's telling to me is that line gets repeated really over the years. This is almost 100 years later in the Kansas Historical Quarterly. And Russell Hickman, in the course of an article talking about the Kansas vegetarian colony, feels the need to insert a bracketed paragraph in which he says, basically, what Kansas needed was beef-eating men. Vegetarians should have a choice of foods of sufficient richness to afford a proper resistance to disease, blah, blah, blah. I just find it fascinating that in the middle of what is supposed to be a scholarly historical piece, he feels compelled to interject some nutritional advice to anybody who might be reading this and get the wrong idea that you might want to, that doing a vegetarian colony in Kansas ever might have been a good idea.
So the idea swings between this colony as a tragic colony, sort of like the Donner Party, and something so ridiculous that it's only the only way you can really describe it is crazy.
Yeah, and as you and I were getting into it more and more, we found ourselves really. And we found other sources. Another settler from the area, Watson Stewart, left behind the memoir. So we're processing these primary documents, and we're reading the secondary documents. And what none of them did really was answer kind of the core question that each of us have as writers and historians.
Which is why.
Why? Next slide. Why would more than 100 men, women, and children pack up all their belongings, empty out their bank accounts, and head west, not to settle with any of the hundreds of other town companies then being set up in territorial Kansas, but this one? Why would they hitch their wagon to this Kansas town company?
And at this time in history.
And at this time of history, that's right. I mean, the Chicago Tribune editors don't have any special knowledge here. Everybody knows that it's going to be rough out there in Kansas. Why combine what's already going to be a difficult journey with vegetarianism? An ism that has been around for less than 10 years at that point. So that was kind of the challenge for us. And so as Diane worked with the text, and originally she was really just working with Miriam's text and with a little bit of Watson Stewart's memoir of this time, kind of the primary source materials that we had. In time, we began to turn our attention to finding out more about
one particular man,
the person who was responsible more than anybody else for conceiving and creating the Kansas vegetarian settlement. And it's this man, next slide, Henry Clubb. Born 1827.
In England.
In England. So he's an Englishman, and this is a picture of him shortly after the vegetarian colony. I think is when it's taken. Let's go to the next slide. Yeah, lives a long life. So some key aspects to know about his life in England. Which is that he is.
He is born from Radical parents. They are Swedenborgians, where they have left the Church of England. They are rebels in their own way. If any of you have been watching Victoria, you know the working class men who were revolting in
The Chartist movement.
The Chartist movement in England at that time in history. So he's using his family is all in when it comes to reform. And also he has some very early sentiments that are going to point the way to him as an adult. He tells this story over and over again about a dove that he finds in the snow on Christmas Eve and rescues, brings it in and nurtures the bird back to health, and that is a big one of the really big reasons why people became vegetarians, because they were
It was an anti-cruelty movement.
Mm-hmm.
Animal welfare leagues would not come along until about 20 years after the Civil War. So it's a late Victorian creation. This is really 1837 is when Victoria takes the throne. And it's in that year that a 10-year-old boy living in Colchester, England, hears about how animals are prepared for the dinner table. And
he talks about the slaughterhouse. There's a man who is a frequent guest in their home, and he tells the family over and over again what he has seen in the slaughterhouses in England. Which is not something you want to have at your dinner conversation.
So so like many and probably all of us. I mean, we know of a pre-teenager who here in the 21st century, and I had a friend growing up, and there will always be sensitive kids who will take the vow that they won't eat meat after hearing that story. But what's amazing about Henry is he will keep that pledge for the next 84 years. But he's kind of a prodigious kid. He's the last of 8 children in his household. And so he grows up around a lot of influences. And one of the things that's going on both sides of the Atlantic is this sense of boundless opportunity and of humanity breaking free from the old strictures and conceiving of a new world. Emerson said that it seemed like everybody he bumped into had a plan for a new community in his waistcoat pocket. This idea that you could rethink civilization by creating communities of like-minded people is one that is in great ferment, particularly among the New England Transcendentalists and their colleagues, their counterparts across the Atlantic. And one of those communities forms southwest of London, just south of the Thames, in Richmond, and it's called on a place called Ham Common, ironically. And they practice vegetarianism, but they also practice a lot of communal life together. It's a utopian community, and they call it Alcott House.
Yeah, and it's filled soon with really idealistic people, especially young people, who want to practice what they've been preached to and over the years. And Henry is very involved, gets very involved in it, and really loves it. He loves the life. He loves the idealism. He even loves the cold showers in the morning. And
5 a.m.
They grow all their own food, and they become a place where some of the really big names of the 19th century come to visit, because Robert Owen being one, and they want to see how this would work. This is the first settlement that we know of.
And in fact, Bronson Alcott, the American educator, will come over and see this community that was named for him. And
this is Louisa May Alcott's father.
And he'll come back to the United States and start his own utopian community called Fruitlands.
Because this reform really washes back and forth between the United States and Britain.
That's right. So they don't have a name for it. They call it the vegetable diet for the most part. But Henry is learning how to grow vegetables on these 4 acres of garden land behind Alcott House. There's an
And fruits.
and fruits and vegetables.
Fruits.
There's an experienced gardener helping him do all this. There's also a gentleman there who has brought a printing press, and because the community wants to publish books and journals to spread their philosophy.
Using Pittman shorthand.
And well, yep, Pittman shorthand is a new shorthand system started by a vegetarian Swedenborgian named Isaac Pittman, and he is in the process of using the new postal rate to create a correspondence course that will someday make it the most practiced shorthand in the world.
This sounds like a minor thing today, but when you realize how incredible it was to be able to be able to record conversation and meetings and whatever else, sermons, and to write it as quickly as you could hear it.
For instance,
It's a breakthrough.
it is a huge breakthrough. And for instance, what's going on here, right? We're being live streamed on the Kansas Historical Society's YouTube channel. So the idea here is that these ideas that were once confined to the second floor of a room at 1855 Constitution Hall are now being beamed around the world. And that is, in fact, the revelation that people are feeling with shorthand, is that they're hearing these dynamic new sermons from progressive preachers. They're hearing these talks about science and nutrition and better health and anti-slavery.
And it can go as fast as the Postal Service.
Yep. And now, instead of being confined to the room where the speech is given, going out into the ether, never again to return, people are able to capture those words at lightning speed, and as Diane said, transmit them as fast as the post will take it. So these are not random improvements. This is a technology in service of a larger philosophy that gets its rise, its lift through the general optimism that's sweeping a lot of circles on both sides of the Atlantic. In terms of this story, that will coalesce in 1847 when a group of people at Alcott House joined forces with a breakaway Swedenborgian church. This is that calls itself the Bible Christian Church, and it's based in Manchester, in England. And they will form something together called the Vegetarian Society. They'll give it a name, and they'll give it a supporting organization.
That's the first time that word vegetarian is used.
Yep. And Henry will be 20 years old.
And he'll be using his
skills to transmit the proceedings of the Vegetarian Society meetings, putting them in the new journal, which he will have a big part in, and then he will also begin lecturing around England on behalf of the Vegetarian Society. So heady stuff, right? We're talking from his late teens into his 20s. He's becoming the principal spokesman, one of the principal spokesmen for this new diet reform, this new way of eating, this new way of living. So that's where we are. And if we can go to the next slide, Diane and I have been to England once. We actually have to go back again because the story's just getting a little richer. But here in the top left corner, this is the intersection in Colchester, England, where Henry Clubb grew up. It was a 3-story brick house. It's been replaced by a 3-story inn. And we're accompanied by a couple of local historians, including Sir Bob Russell, who was the Member of Parliament at that time, representing Colchester. And they were very pleased to hear that we were kind of retracing Henry's steps. Not everything is on the internet. You sometimes actually have to go to libraries and look them up. And so there we are at the British Library. And then we also went to an archives in Philadelphia and in Michigan, where Henry's publications and effects were left. And there you see kind of a sample of the Pittman shorthand, and it's a very elegant writing system.
but not great for people who are trying to write the stories. They love to know Pittman shorthand, and not everybody does, even those who know shorthand, because this is a specialized version of Pittman shorthand.
Yeah, there was 19.
So we
This
had
is
to
old.
find somebody who could read this and
This is
take it
old
along
Pittman
with.
shorthand. Yeah, there's 20th century Pittman shorthand. There's something called Pittman 2000, which sounds hilarious. But Henry, of course, lived in the 19th century, and he wrote the original Pittman, and it was different. But we did find an original Pittman shorthand interpreter, and until we ran out of money, we paid her to translate. We'll get it all done one of these days. But you just really get a sense of a time and a spirit and a mood. You know, as you said, they were breaking away from the Church of England, and it was just this whole mindset, this mentality, and you can see it as a thread through all the big reform movements at that time. This idea that we're not going to accept what authority tells us is gospel truth. We're going to investigate it for ourselves. We're not going to, and that revelation was provided not to the leaders of the church to dispel and filter for us, but they are provided to all believers for their improvement and for growing closer to God. And I think the essential thing about Swedenborgianism is it rejects this concept of dualism, where you have the body, which is sinful and bad and decrepit, and we're going to leave it behind when we die, and the spirit, which is good and perfect and comes from God. Swedenborgians reject that. Emanuel Swedenborg, the mystic whose writings is the basis for the new church, the Swedenborgian church, said that there's the spiritual realm, there's the heavenly realm, and there's the physical realm, and the two interact, and they're both good. And our job here on earth is, in fact, to work on bringing our body into accord with the spiritual realm, with the heavenly realm. And so that's an animating spirit, and it's maybe kind of hard for us to connect with a little bit in the 21st century. And kind of one of our challenges is
You were optimistic people.
Yeah. Yep. And in fact, if we can go to the next slide, this is a we're going to quote a few of the 39 reasons why Henry Clubb is a vegetarian. This is a book that he put out later on, 39 reasons, and the very first words in the book are, "I am an optimist." He is a vegetarian first and foremost because he's an optimist. And then in reason number 3, he says a spiritual-minded man cannot partake of that which requires him to destroy the lives of inoffensive creatures because the very thought is repugnant to his nature. So connecting the physical realm to the spiritual realm. Let's look at the next one. By living thus in harmony with the original law of food as given by Moses, man becomes a cooperator with the Creator and endowed with those faculties that enable him to resist and overcome diseased conditions. Okay, so that's another part of the age. People are getting sick all the time. People have low lifespans and low quality of life while they're living. How do you improve that? You need to go back and read your scripture.
And sometimes the treatment is worse than the illness.
That's right.
There's still at a point in history where there's bloodletting and other gruesome ways to treat people with illness.
Yeah.
And these people were really starting to say, you need to treat this with what you eat and how you live.
Yeah. And get back to what the Holy Scripture tells you, which is, and you see he invokes Genesis 1:29, and that scripture reads, "And God said, Behold, I've given you every herb-bearing seed which is upon the face of the earth, and every tree in the which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed. To you it shall be for meat." And that's I'm reading the King James Version, but that's the justification that Henry Clubb will return to again and again. Scripture says it's the herbs and the fruit of the trees, the vegetables. That is our meat. That's what we should be eating. And if we do that, we get closer to God. And if we get closer to God, we certainly won't want to take the life inoffensive creatures like animals. And then one more. Let's just do one more. Get on. To the people who said that Kansas needs beef-eating men, the most laborious animals, like the mule, like the horse, sustain like the elephant, sustain their strength on grain, grass, and water. Therefore, there need be no fear of sustaining health and strength on what nature has provided for her most powerful and faithful laborers.
These sound like pretty contemporary reasons that you hear, not in this language, but they were pretty advanced in their understanding of this.
And Henry is tested. He goes and gives these talks all throughout to thousands of people around England. He's a very busy lecturer throughout the 1850s. But then one of his mentors, I think it's James Brotherton, says to him, the future is really in the United States. That's where you need to go. If you're going to spread this gospel, and if you're going to do good work, you need to go to the United States. And so, next slide. In 1853, he gets on a packet ship, and 6 weeks later, he's in New York.
And he's in New York at a really critical time in history, at a really optimistic time. It's the peak of optimism because everything's going to go down the drain pretty soon. But when he arrives, the big reform movements are at full tilt. There is a convention in New York in that year in which is organizing women's rights people in a huge reform. And they're anti-slavery, temperance, water cure,
all these things. And those of you who've read Diane's book know that what an important time that fall of 1853 is in New York City.
If you think about what's coming.
Yep. The New York, the First World's Fair in New York is being held there at their Crystal Palace. And so you got people coming from all over, and they're having these big conventions. And of course, the opponents are sending the rowdies in to break it up. So, and those of you who know from Diane's book on Clarendon Nichols, it's just a very contentious time, but it's also a very spirited time. People feel like the world is on the move. There's a good time coming, right?
Yeah. What does it say on that?
Oh, yeah. So this is the program that got saved. It's in the Library of Congress for the Whole World's Temperance Convention. And whoever saved this wrote a note. The Whole World's Temperance Convention. See, there were 2 temperance conventions that month. They were going to have this, and the organizers said, we're going to have this temperance convention to promote the anti-alcohol laws across the North. But no women are going to be allowed to speak or serve in leadership.
So they walked out and formed...
And not just the women, Horace Greeley and...
Yeah, some of the leaders...
Said,
okay, if you're not going to allow women, we're all going to leave and we're going to form something they call the Whole World's Temperance.
and somebody writes at the top, this was virtually a women's rights convention. Okay, so, but that next slide... That's what's going on here. We have all of these reforms, and they're all taking place at the same time, and there's tremendous overlap. People will just go from one convention to the next because they're enthusiasts for the water cure, this idea that you can get healthier, not by taking a doctor's elixirs and bloodletting, but by just going off to a retreat in Vermont and taking daily baths and getting lots of sleep. Nude baths. And eating simple foods. Getting away from the bad diet. Usually it's a vegetarian diet. And taking it easy. Harriet Beecher Stowe recovers her health at one of these water cures. Temperance. Dress reform. This is about the time Amelia Bloomer is promoting her way of getting away from those heavy, cumbersome, constricting dresses. Education we've talked about.
Uncle Tom's Cabin is playing on Broadway.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Anti-slavery, women's suffrage. There's Sabbath days, sanitation, anti-spitting leagues are formed. Some of it seems kind of funny, but it's the same people will then go to a prison reform meeting, and a lot of these people take great interest in this new movement that's also formed an American society for the promotion of
So it really
vegetarianism.
is not a fringe movement at that time. You have some of the big names in history who become vegetarians during this process. People like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Thoreau and Susan B. Anthony and Clorinda Nichols, for that matter. They all become vegetarians.
Henry realizes very early on that this is actually probably a kind of almost a sidecar movement to the temperance movement, which at that point, people forget this, but temperance, up until this point, the fall of 1853, is the big reform movement in America. They are passing Maine laws that heavily restrict the sale and consumption of alcoholic beverages. There are millions of people who've taken temperance pledges. It's a very big movement. And Henry sees, and if you can see the next slide, another one of his 39 reasons, the consumption of flesh as food has, like the use of tobacco and alcoholic liquors, a tendency to deaden the moral and intellectual faculties, to blind the perceptions to the practice. So this is 100 years before the Surgeon General, folks. People know tobacco is bad. People certainly know that alcohol destroys lives. And what Henry Clubb is making a case for and getting an audience for is the idea that what we put in our body as food is equally as important as what we put in for drink or tobacco. So this is the world that he finds himself in. And the fall of 1853, very optimistic time. But Henry's got to work. Right? He's picked up some business as a stringer for Horace Greeley's New York Tribune, but really he needs steady employment.
So he goes to Washington, D.C., where the Congress is debating the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And he becomes a person who was a reporter at the biggest show in history at that time. And he's there because he's got Pitman's shorthand skills, and he records.
He's not in the gallery. He's in the reporter's booth. Yeah. He's in a reporter's desk on the floor of the United States House.
Which is a really amazing time to be watching Congress work. And I think probably everybody here knows the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
We don't have to explain
we don't have to explain that one, I hope.
Yeah, but now you can start to see the wheels turning because he's grown up at Alcott House.
Right. He's lived in a utopian community. He sees the opportunity. He starts to think, could I form a colony somewhere in the United States? How would I do that?
And he sees all this cheap Western land out here. By sitting in Congress, he learns exactly how much it's going for per acre. And he begins to think, okay, we want to prove, right, that Emerson quote, I've got an idea in my waistcoat pocket for a vegetarian colony. And in fact, in the pages of the Water Cure Journal, one of the most popular journals of this day with 100,000 subscribers, they are talking, the readers in the letter section are talking back and forth about how do we go out and form a community so that we can reinforce healthy lifestyles amongst ourselves. Henry picks up on this, merges it with what he now knows about Kansas, and says, I have an idea.
Yep. But he also wants to see it for himself, so he goes to South Carolina in order to see slavery as it exists. Because behind it or mixed in with all this optimism is the reality that we have 4 million enslaved people in this country. For whom the future is very dire, and the present is very dire. And so after he visits South Carolina and sees all this, he starts to think, maybe I could combine these things. That time when he was a teenager and an idealistic one and believing that anything was possible. So he combines the things, and that's how Kansas gets to be chosen as the site for this new movement.
So 1855 is where things start to move. Next slide. He goes back to New York and to Fowler and Welch, which is the publisher of the Water Cure Journal, along with a lot of other progressive works. Also books on phrenology, but we won't get into that. Says will you publish if I can get enough subscribers for it, will you publish a vegetarian almanac? And this is going to be the primary device by which he promotes his idea for a Kansas vegetarian settlement company, a town company that will go out to Kansas and form, just like the hundreds of other town companies that are forming at that time, but his will have a vegetarianism at its center. And Fowler and Wells does this on contract. By the way, also that year they'll on contract publish a book of poems by another free-thinking young man named Walt Whitman. And Henry gets his vegetarian almanac out and starts putting notices in the Water Cure Journal and kindred publications. And 100 people show up at the Water Cure Institute in May of 1855, and 73 of them sign up. They say, we're in. And several of them leave money as their initial stake on what will be a $5 per acre share on this future colony. A water cure physician named John McLaurin volunteers to go out to Kansas and scout out the territory. And in 1855, as you may know, from one of the signs, or one of the great informative signs here, there's one devoted just to the land office. By the way, if you have not gone around the Lecompton site and read these historical signs, they are really excellent and well done. And there's one in here just on the land office and what chaos there was trying to sort out all the land claims that were being made among people, many of whom were squatting on the same piece of land. Henry and Company will not have that problem because John McLaurin finds land way down south, 100 miles from here at least. And it's actually, he doesn't know it at the time, but he's actually on Osage lands. He describes it to Henry, it's about 32,000 acres in size, and he comes back and promptly collapses because he's been sleeping out in plain air for about a month during a typical May during a typical August and September in Kansas. Yeah, so he's pretty sick. But he's going to he leaves Henry with the plans for this new colony. So he's got the people in place. He's got the land there once they get out there. But Henry is, if nothing else, a dreamer and a planner. He likes to draw things. And this next slide here will show you kind of the cherry on top of the Kansas Vegetarian Colony. It will actually be the Kansas Vegetarian and Octagon Settlement Company. So Orson Fowler of the Fowler and Wells family, water cure publishers, phrenologists, one of his most popular books is one in which he argues for people to stop building square houses and start building 8-sided houses. He says it's a more healthful design, it lets in more sunshine, keeps it warmer. What else does he say? He says a lot of things about it.
It keeps it warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. And so you really magnify the comfort of the home and the ability to heat it inexpensively.
And I think maybe some of you have seen Octagon houses that were built in the 1800s. There's several in Kansas. And it all kind of stems from this seed that Orson Fowler plants with his book,
A Home for All.
A Home for All. And Henry Clubb just says, well, what if we apply that idea to town planning? Which is kind of a oddball genius sort of thing to do because, in about 40 years, people will begin planning new ways, new optimal ways for people to live in communities together. And it will be based on this idea that people want the best of town and country. They want to live in close quarters with other people like them, have the neighborhood, but they also want to be able to go out their back door and see nature and experience nature and grow their own food or whatever they're wanting to get out of the country. They want that as well. Mm-hmm. And the Octagon, if you look at it here, the Octagon really maximizes that. So you have in the center, you have this what they call the center octagon. By the way, this is a section of land, and then the company takes the triangles off and reserves that for their use, and that leaves 102 acres, I think. And then that's carved into 8 pie pieces, and in the center is where you will have the cultural center, the community center for the gatherings and the talks, right? The lecturers, the lyceums, and all and the store, and all the things that the community does together, and the school, of course. And then, and so the houses will face that way, and then behind the houses you've got all this land, which you can either choose to farm or, and this is where Henry the schemer comes in here, right? You can subdivide it and sell it off once people begin flocking to Octagon City.
So this is really going to be a utopian community. This is going to feature all the good things about building and about making a town out of nothing.
Yeah, and this is the closest that we can find to a definition of success that Henry Clubb ever writes about his idea for a settlement. We shall have a settlement of farms, parks, gardens, and dwellings, healthfully arranged in that octagon, which in a few short years shall be a source of lasting enjoyment to ours and a blessing to posterity. And he writes that on the prospectus that he sends out to the 100 or so people at that point who have pledged to come out to Kansas, and many of them have pledged money.
And what happens? So
then reality sets in. But we will go to the next slide. He and his new wife will arrive in the area around the Neosho in April of 1856 and begin work on a meeting house. Within 6 weeks, the Colt family will arrive and find that nothing has happened. There's a half-built log cabin. It's not in the shape of an octagon. People are hunkered over campfires. They're living in tents. And the ladies tell us, she says, that they are sorry to see us come to this place. So the Colts are the last to arrive. It's not only Miriam and her immediate family, but the in-laws have come along too.
And they also happen to choose the time to come, which is one of the most famous times in Kansas history, of course, which is Bleeding Kansas. That summer was Bleeding Kansas with John Brown.
Yeah, they
don't know this.
No, they're in the colony less than 10 days when Pottawatomie Creek happens. The burning of Lawrence, and the caning of Sumner, and the massacre at Pottawatomie Creek. So they're really in it, but they're not in it for long. Some things go out with a bang. The Octagon and vegetarian settlement will go out with a whimper. The next slide. Families begin leaving. Pretty much, many of them, Miriam says, were already gone by the time they arrived. And others would come and after a few days of disappointment, they would leave. The Colts decide to stay. I think we've concluded it's in part because
the father-in-law,
yeah.
he's hoping to make a killing in Kansas.
Yeah.
He's not so much interested in forming a vegetarian community as he is in his life. He thinks this is his last chance to make a fortune for himself. That's not so different from a lot of people who came to Kansas.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But Henry does. Henry falls ill with the fever and ague, and
also known as malaria.
And eventually he realizes that this is not going to work, and he leaves. And he actually goes to a water cure in Chicago to recover his health. Miriam and her husband and son leave. They leave the in-laws behind, and they start back east.
But did you read or can you find the stone that the?
Oh yeah, the next slide.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so this is the account that they. So let's go back to this is the historic marker that's located on Old 169 Highway between Humboldt and Chanute near the vegetarian settlement, and this is the account that is given today as to why this colony collapsed. There was a lack of successful crops. There were mosquitoes, there was deathly fever, and starvation. And that led to scores of deaths. Now, this is the most exaggerated account. But you do find elements of this, right? I mean, there were in fact deaths at the colony. There were mosquitoes, but to attribute this to these particular causes is, and sort of hovering over all of this is the idea that someone took their money and left them to die. As you probe into that, and certainly in the scholarship, it's kind of hard to avoid that most historians have reached the same conclusion about that. If we can get the next slide. Food was actually not in short supply at the vegetarian colony. They brought a lot of it in, and they had berries, they had plums.
They ate everything that was that they could. They planted huge gardens, and in the spring they had other things too. They had the spring.
They had spring crops.
Yeah.
Purslane, every gardener's, the bane of many Kansas gardeners' backyard, along with bindweed. Purslane is, in fact, a highly nutritious plant, and they knew it. Miriam Colt, in her diary, it's not all gloom and doom, by the way, in her book. There is a period of time where she's feeling optimistic as well. And one of the things she says is that when I boil up the purslane and mix it with the cornmeal, the Johnny cake, that's good eating.
She also says that she had never before been so slim and healthy as she was that summer.
So there you go. It is true that certain people were affected by the mosquitoes and the mosquito-borne malaria, and at that time people did not know.
They didn't know, they did not know that the female
Mosquito carried a bacteria.
carried a bacteria that would cause great pain and suffering.
Yeah.
But if you had been exposed to it in your childhood, you had generally less malaria, less hardy,
Which
heavy.
which the Englishman Henry Clubb did not, which the Broadbent brothers, who actually died in their tent in late August, had not been exposed to it either.
So there were 3 people who died. The third one was an older man, Miriam's father-in-law.
That's right.
There were not scores of deaths.
Yeah, and the other narrative line here that is easy to believe is that these Easterners were woefully unprepared. Right? They weren't ready for the hardships of Kansas. If we can get the next slide. This is a new, we just found this in the last 2 months. This is another contemporary account of the Kansas vegetarian colony. This man appears on the register, William Somerville, of people who came to Kansas, put their money in. William Somerville grew up in England and was working in a factory job, kind of a dead-end factory job in Massachusetts, when he heard about this colony. And they put everything into coming out to Kansas. And their possessions, Henry had told them to leave them behind in St. Louis and just head out to the colony. Their possessions would come behind them. They never came. They actually found them on their way back east after leaving the colony. And he writes his parents immediately after this, and the parents then take this letter down to the local newspaper, and they print it in July of that summer. So people are still at the Colts, and the clubs are still at the colony when this is going on. Henry S. Clubb was the manager of the whole affair, and for such an office he was utterly unfit, writes William Somerville.
His skill was not his skill. Skill set.
But the next line, nothing else was otherwise than what we expected for a new country. And Somerville makes it clear they were ready for the hardships. They were ready to sleep out in the open. They were ready to eat Johnny cake and mush and molasses, I think, as Clarina's son really clever said. They were ready to eat whatever was necessary, do whatever was necessary for as long as it took to get the community established. But what they had not counted on was a manager of the colony who could not manage. And it's worth asking how many Kansas town companies failed because of mismanagement. I mean, I'm not convinced that there was anything special about Henry Clubb in that respect. And that as he defined success, maybe was a little grandiose. But what if they had made it through one winter, right? 4 seasons of the year. They brought in a crop in the fall. They would have gotten help from their Osage neighbors. I feel fairly convinced of that. And they had made it through that whole year, right? I mean, how many years really did Quindaro have in it? The settlement on the Missouri River. Basically, it had one good year, right? Maybe two. But we still remember Quindaro, Kansas, as this, because it was committed to an idea and a principle, and things happened there that didn't happen anywhere else in Kansas. And so we tend to take the view that had a few things broken Henry Club's and the other settlers' way, that maybe it wouldn't have worked out exactly the way that they imagined, but
So it's not a tragedy or
a swindle.
or a swindle.
But it was a town company, one of many hundreds in Kansas, but one of the most distinct ideas in an era in which ideas were highly valued, and people could imagine forming a community out of an idea in their waistcoat pocket. Just a little bit of a PS here, or the next slide. This is one of the reasons this book is a work in progress, is because we're kind of fleshing out some of the details of Henry's life after the colony, because he will live for, 65 more years?
He is age 94.
94. He will spend, 20 years kind of in the wilderness, literally and figuratively. He will get involved in anti-slavery activity, as everybody starts to get involved in the
He will
North.
help elect Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln, that's right. He will serve in the Civil War.
Yes, he will. He will be wounded, but he's a pacifist, so he's
Non-combatant.
with as a non-combatant, but still gets injured. He goes back to his town in Michigan,
Where his wife is from.
and he gets trees,
He's
fruit trees
He's kind of the Johnny Appleseed of
planted all over the county for people who need the fruits and don't have them themselves. They will.
And he'll promote fruit. He'll promote fruit growing in the entire Western Michigan region because he's a booster, but he's also a believer in a certain way of eating.
He will serve in Michigan
State Senate.
As a state senator. He will move to Pennsylvania with his family and to become a minister.
At the U.S. Home of the Bible Christian Church, this same tiny offshoot of the Swedenborgian Church will send a missionary group to the United States to form a Bible Christian church based on vegetarian principles in Philadelphia. And that church will ask Henry Club to be their minister, and he will serve there the last 40 years of his life.
Mm-hmm.
And about 10 years in, he will come back and he will come full circle again. Because the Civil War, as you like to say about the women's rights movement, the Civil War swallowed up everything that wasn't abolition. All these other great causes just, get consumed by the energy of the...
But he will get involved in the love
the peace movement.
in the peace movement after the war, and he will be at the Chicago World's Fair, making friends with
Other vegetarians.
from around the world. And after that, he publishes a vegetarian, what would you call it?
Well, a monthly magazine called Food, Home, and Garden. Yeah, yeah, in the 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's actually a great great journal.
Form a vegetarian restaurant in New York.
In New York, but I want to get this point in that he refounds 10 years into his tenure at the Philadelphia Bible Christian Church. He restarts the Vegetarian Society of America, which went moribund during the Civil War, and that is the predecessor to today's vegetarian movement. So as sort of the capstone to his career, he begins giving these interviews late in life, talking about the long-term effects of a vegetarian diet. And if you could hit the clicker.
It's a walking advertisement.
Yep.
For the movement.
The same newspaper that in 1856 mocked him for his vegetarian lifestyle, saying that what Kansas needs is beef-eating men, the Chicago Tribune will will laud his 65 years of meatless living. As president of the Vegetarian Society, he is able to furnish proof that to do without meat does not impair the bodily vigor. So this is a story about a person, but it's also a story about a movement and about a time. And I think you had the same kind of issue with Clorinda Nichols. Like, you didn't really want it to be a biography of a woman because it's just kind of too easy to say, well, wasn't that person special? What Clorinda Nichols did, and I think what Henry Clubb did, is capture a time in our history that's a time of great optimism and possibility.
Yeah, kept the lights on.
Kept the lights on. Yeah. We have time for some questions. Yes.
Do you know what happened to Miriam Cole?
Oh, tell
Yes.
what happened to Mary.
Yeah, she goes back to New York, upper New York State. Her husband and son have died, and she gets insurance money, $2,000 I think, and she builds her own house. She plans it all, builds it all. She supports herself, selling eggs and keeping a renter in and so forth. But she never loses her bitterness for the experience in Kansas because it carried off and changed her life. But she lived to into her 80s, 84 I believe she was, or 88. So she keeps the faith.
Yes.
I was reading somewhere, I'm not sure where it was, about why in the 1800s in Compton there was a vegetarian wine bunch here. Because it'd be considerable amount of wine.
Oh, that's outstanding. I'm going to enjoy this.
Hear anything about that?
No, I'm going to enjoy this speaking circuit a lot. If we keep hearing things like this, I'm going to enjoy this a lot because I was not aware. Can we talk afterwards about that?
I don't know very much about it. I can't remember where the story was.
Well, maybe Paul can point me in the right direction because
Paul knows everything.
yeah, I think that'd be fantastic. Yes.
So I'm wondering if you know anything about the Bible Christian Church having a conflict later with the Vegetarian Society, and some people wanting it to exclude like all dairy products.
Yep. So one of the things she's asking about the Bible Christian Church and the larger vegetarian movement, and this is in fact kind of a debate that wasn't a debate for many years, and now it is, and that is, was the early vegetarian movement actually vegan? Did they exclude all animal products, including milk and butter and cheese, dairy products? It is certainly true that at Ellicott House, there's no description of any dairy products and keeping any cows on site. It's also true that if you look through the articles in Food, Home, and Garden, the journal that Henry published, it has cooking sections. In fact, Mrs. Clubb has a Thanksgiving dinner course by course through there for your vegetarian friends. It's clear that they like their dairy. And the Bible Christian Church generally was what they call ovo-lacto, which I think is...
I think it depends on the individual. I mean, I think we need to do more research on that to know for sure.
You know...
That's an important point.
And let's remember that when Miriam Colt Davis brought her, came out to Kansas, she brought a cow and a calf.
Mm-hmm.
And the cow and the calf stayed together. So she was not practicing modern dairy agricultural techniques, and so part of what is interesting is that the objections to animal agriculture in the mid-19th century are, in one sense, different because animal agriculture and the harvesting of meat was just practiced so differently back then. But if you read some of these quotes, and we put some of them up here to be deliberately provocative in that way, they resonate. And this is the thing. We don't know if Henry Clubb has any influence on modern vegetarianism. Right? When he dies, the church dies, and to some degree the Vegetarian Society goes underground for a few decades. But a writer named Irene Chang, who is kind of looking at some of these grandiose utopian schemes from the 19th century says, you know, in the art history world, when we recover an artist, we often do it not because that person has a direct tie to today, but because what they did back then resonates today. And so if we can think about history the way that some people think about art, it's that Henry Clubb was creating something in the 19th century under completely different conditions. But in some way, what he's doing resonates with us now. And whether he was a vegetarian or a vegan, I think is maybe beside the point, because I think if he were witnessing kind of how the modern dairy industry works, you know, he might apply that same critique. But that was a different time. Yes?
Please make a statement about the significance of Quindaro, Kansas.
Yeah. The significance of Quindaro. You want to tackle that? What makes it?
Well, it was, in
What's significant about it?
well, it was an underground railroad site. That's probably what you're thinking about.
It's also, Quindaro is, at that time, the only free state port along the Missouri River.
Mm-hmm.
The pro-slavery forces which control this house, the legislature meeting out of Compton, they control the law enforcement in Douglas County, and they control, and they've got buddies next door in Missouri. They are trying to basically embargo the free state movement out of existence by blocking every single port along the Kansas River.
And they have a tri-state history, which is pretty unique. Tri-racial history, yeah.
Yeah,
mm-hmm.
yeah.
Which,
So because the
Wyandottes own the land, and slaves who are emancipating themselves are coming across into the white abolitionists are settled into that town.
Yeah. Quindaro has always captured people's imagination, and we should note that this week, the bill in Congress to designate Quindaro's ruins as a national commemorative site was passed, and I think it's going to the Senate, but it's with the support of our previous representative Carolyn Yoder and our new representative Sharice Davids is moving its way to completion. And I don't think it would get that kind of congressional support if people didn't feel like what they did back then, even though it was for a short period of time, was historically significant.
Is that what you were asking for?
Yes.
I may have misheard, but when you were talking about the water cure, I thought you said they were promoting nude bathing.
Was that
Well,
most
if
people
they didn't bathe nude, how did they get
They did sunbathing in the nude. That I misspoke.
Yeah, Walt Whitman called it an air bath that he liked to take. Whitman was into those tours. But certainly the thing about the water cure is it just, at the time, it was the alternative health movement of its time. But I think we would now say that, you know, allopathic doctors are much more likely to prescribe rest and a healthy diet before they administer drugs and exercise. Yeah.
What is the water cure?
Well, what like a typical water cure establishment? How would that work?
What do you mean?
What is the water cure? Like
What is the water
It
cure?
is it would be like a gym or a
Spa.
spa in which you come and you spend a night or a week or a month or a year convalescing.
Yeah. But they oftentimes they would wake you up at dawn, and
it was different. Yeah.
they cover you with wet blankets. They would give you a cold bath. These were often located near natural springs. There's one in Brattleboro, Vermont, the hometown of Clarence Nichols.
And that's also kind of what happened at the end of the 19th century with the vegetarian movement, is that it really, one branch goes off this way into individual healthful living and all of this, and another one goes into commercial production.
Battle Creek, Michigan, right?
Graham crackers, for example, are considered health food. And now they're really just a sugary wafer cookie, right? Which we love, but they really have nothing to do with health.
Yeah.
And a lot of the cereal that comes out of Michigan was also not particularly healthy, but its roots were back in the movement itself.
Somebody who wrote a history of the vegetarian movement said that the progression in the 19th century was from abstention to consumption, right? This idea that one needed to practice personal discipline to get healthier, that gets replaced with, if you eat this food product that we're selling, you're going to get better. Oh, whether it's sugary or not, the idea is go out and buy something. Don't change your lifestyle and do something for yourself. And that is really kind of the push and pull even today with the healthy lifestyle. Like some people see this as just needless sacrifice. And why are we denying ourselves this? It's fake science anyway. And then, but then those same people may embrace a solution that they can invest in, pay money for, create jobs because it'll save the planet. Yes, Paul, you had your hand up.
She asked about Madera. I'm going to plug your book, The Big Divide. Anyone who's interested in any historic site between eastern Kansas and western Missouri, I strongly urge you to buy the book, Big Divide.
Thank you.
Because it stresses the importance of the historic sites in this area. Because I think everyone needs to know that there were at one time 16 historic sites in Kansas that were open full time. Today there's only one, and that's Constitution Hall right here in Lecompton.
Oh, wow.
If you know a state senator or a state representative, you need to tell them that these historic sites is where history occurred in this state anyway.
Yeah.
I'm sure in Missouri also. But that Big Divide is an excellent book.
That is a great plug, and not just for our book, but for the historic significance of the sites that many people have worked countless person hours to interpret and reinterpret over the years. And we're delighted, of course, to be part of that community. The Big Divide is the book that we wish was available when we moved to this area 22 years ago. And so we're delighted to share it with other people. As you just briefly mentioned, we sell all of our books for $15, even the hardcovers, and we're happy to sign the ones with our names on them. We published 3 books that are also good sellers for us. A couple of them are carried at the Gettysburg Historic Site in Pennsylvania. Really, in each case, it's really not about military history of the Civil War. It's about the persons, the people, the women, the children, and the political movements that are often get kind of shortchanged when telling the history of that great conflict. Yes.
An offshoot of the water cure was the mineral springs baths.
Yes.
And that's
Mineral baths,
involved
yeah.
bathing and purging both ends.
Yeah.
No.
Absolutely, they're directly connected.
Yeah.
Because my grandmother was heavily involved in that. So I know all.
That's right. And those tend to get made fun of, right? Like the road to Wellsville, right? You get a laugh whenever you say, anything enema, right? That's hilarious. But the reality is that these people were desperate oftentimes for a cure. And allopathic medicine was practicing things that go back centuries, well into the 19th century. And then once they discovered,
Wasn't George Washington killed by?
Well, I think a number of presidents who were shot, died of the cure, rather than most of our presidents who have died in office did not die of their wounds; they died of doctors. So that might be an overstatement.
It's a little bit of an overstatement.
But that's what we forget. This was a big, giant social pushback. And it resonates a little bit today. People feel like too often they go to the doctor and they get prescribed something, told to take something rather than do something, right? And that's part of that tension between abstention and consumption. About something I can do, preventative, and something that we're going to give you curative. So that's where I think the story of Henry Clubb and the vegetarian colony is really interesting. Any last words, Tim? I see Tim walking up here with our certificate of appreciation.
Thank you very much for presenting the certificate for being our speaker today. Thank you very much, Aaron. Always a great program.
Thank you, Tim. Thank you. Thank you.
Those treats in the back, right?
Yeah, Joanne did a great job. Is there anything left?
There is still a lot of food left.
So if you haven't tried the plant-based cheesecake, I strongly recommend
Thank you so much for bringing it.
that. That's a wonderful display. Thank you, and the color guide as well. We just kind of leafed through it. That's like a very informative guide. Anyway, you can see for us, it's history is at its core, but it's a really interesting conversation to carry into the present day. So thank you for being part of that conversation.
Hope to see you out next Sunday. Hope better weather, and we've got Dr. Carl Graves coming in. He's going to talk about Battle of Mine Creek. So hope to see you next Sunday at 2 o'clock. Thank you very much.